Okay, 11 a.m. Let's get started. So this is our last unit of the course, so we're in the home stretch. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but someone I mentioned to them in passing and they seemed surprised. If I haven't mentioned, this is my last semester at the U of A. Oh, okay, so I haven't mentioned it. So this is my last time teaching a new unit, so it's been fun. Let's enjoy this last unit. So I'm moving back to BC for another job. Someone new? Oh, well, I guess that's. Are you doing me leaving or BC? Hopefully, me leaving. Okay, so the topics in this unit are all directly or indirectly related to free will. If you want to think about it that way, that may help you group everything together. So this chapter, chapter 9, is about virtues. And a good chunk of the chapter is on the question of, do virtues, which we can choose to cultivate, determine what we do, or the situation? So kind of indirectly related to the free will issue. Chapter 10 is on moral responsibility, so whether we can hold people responsible for what they do. And then chapter 11, the last chapter with content we'll be covering, is on free will. There's also chapter 12, but that's just a conclusion. There's not anything testable there. Chapter 11, the free will chapter, I will use as a springboard to talk about punishment, the psychology of punishment. And then that'll be our last topic. So, as I say, the chapter 9, which we'll get started on today, is on virtues. So commonly in normative ethics, people divide theories into 3 buckets. We spent a lot of time on the first 2 buckets, but this one's on the third bucket. So the first bucket is consequentialist theories, so the most famous and influential, of course, being utilitarianism. So that's about the effects or consequences of actions. Deontology, which is about rules or duties. So that goes back to Kant. And then the third bucket is virtue ethics, where what's focused on is traits that people have that are either virtuous or not virtuous. And the most important proponent of this approach is Aristotle. So remember that kind of the 3 most famous Greek philosophers are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, in that order. So Socrates was Plato's teacher, and then Plato was Aristotle's teacher. There's a famous picture of them. I don't know if you guys have seen, probably seen it somewhere on the internet. If you just look up philosophy, like philosophers painting, it'll probably come up. Yep, so this is the most famous. In the middle is Plato and Aristotle. And if you zoom in, this is what they look like. And the idea is that Plato's pointing up at the heavens, Aristotle's hands pointing towards the ground. I don't know if it was the intention of the painter, but the idea was what Plato thought was really important were the heavenly forms, this invisible realm that you could apprehend through pure reason, whereas Aristotle's pointing down, so he was more of what we would call in philosophy an empiricist. But with regard to ethics, he was, as I say, a virtue ethicist. So what matters are not measuring the effects of actions or abstract principles, but virtues. And if you look at any moral dilemma or moral situation, what Aristotle will say is a virtuous person would know what to do. It's going to be somewhat situation dependent. If you, through habit and through learning from examples, cultivate these virtues, you'll know what the right thing to do is. So the right thing to do is not to have a rule book in your head, like Kant would say, or to have to be measuring the consequences, but to cultivate the right virtues. Now, one rough guide for what counts as virtues is his idea of the golden mean. Mean here being average, sort of like in statistics, though this is going to be less precise than that. And I should say too, when Aristotle and the ancient Greeks speak of virtue, they mean it in a broader sense than we often do nowadays. Following perhaps the influence of Christianity, morality is construed as sort of selfless benefiting of others. If you're a moral person, it means you're self-sacrificial, nice, and so on. While that's included here, the term virtue, the etymology of the Greek term for virtue relates to excellence. So being an excellent human. Not just in terms of being nice to people, but all sorts of positive character traits. For example, having a good sense of humor. In our modern way of using the term moral, it might be kind of strange to say that being funny is a moral virtue, but virtue ethics is, as I say, broader. So going back to the golden mean, one example that's easy to understand is courage. So for Aristotle, the virtues usually have each virtue has two corresponding vices. So a vice is the opposite of a virtue. It's a bad trait. There will be a vice of deficiency and a vice of excess. Vice of deficiency meaning too little of this, vice of excess meaning too much. And the virtue is the golden mean, something that's in the middle. So think of courage. So, pretend your country is invaded and there's a call to defend your country. Cowardice would be not showing up. Aristotle would say that's not virtuous. That's a vice of deficiency. If you don't join your local, join the army or anything, but charge into battle against the enemy armed only with a knife, that would not be courage according to Aristotle. That's a vice of excess. Maybe foolishness or rashness or something. So to be courageous is to know when to take risks. So courage is going to be in between those two vices. Now, when exactly should you apply this? Again, Aristotle's going to say, you'll know if you're a virtuous person. There's not going to be a statistical formula for when to do X, Y, or Z. As another example, I mentioned sense of humor. You can imagine there are two extremes. Right? If you're a prude, you just never laugh at anything, you're like, that's not very funny. That's a vice according to Aristotle. If you're too far the other way, like if you're an ass clown or a pig and just kind of joking all the time, for Aristotle, that's also a vice. Maybe my family's close to that, I don't know. The virtue of having a good sense of humor would be being in the middle. Nothing too fancy there, but to reinforce this, I'll show a video. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Is it somewhat circular in that you have what counts as virtuous? You'll know when you are virtuous?
Yes, it's a very good piece of pushback. I'm not an Aristotelian, maybe not the best person to defend it, but yes, people have made that charge. This is not a serious moral theory. If you just say, well, you'll know it when you see it. It's like, okay, well. And he'll also say, well, you should imitate virtuous people. And then you say, well, how do I know who the virtuous people are? And the idea of the golden mean could be maybe a rough guide to that. Look at the people who fall in that range, although even there, he's going to say there's not an exact formula for knowing where the golden mean is. Any other questions before I show a video? Okay, so that's a helpful video. One thing I forgot to mention that he pointed out is that the virtuous person will do the right thing effortlessly, just out of a matter of habit. And this is another way in which Aristotle is different from Kant, where Kant thought you should do the right thing out of a sense of duty, whereas Aristotle says, no, if you're the right kind of person, a virtuous person, you'll enjoy doing the right thing, and that's actually better. The video, however, had one mistake. Hank says that Aristotle thought that all virtues exist at the golden mean. That's not true. He thought there were some exceptions. It's been a while since I was forced to read the Nicomachean Ethics in grad school, but there are exceptions. So I don't have enough memorized to tell you what the right answer here is, but this is our first discussion question. What are some exceptions to this, if you can think of any? In other words, cases where you don't want to be in the middle, you want to be as much or as little of trait X. So there's a topic to break into groups and discuss. Okay, it started to go quiet. What are some examples that different groups thought of? Possible exceptions to the golden mean. You all just think the golden mean is exceptionless. Aristotle's just 100%. Okay, yep.
We talked about trait psychopathy or Machiavellianism.
Interesting. Trait psychopathy. Yeah, a little confidence can't hurt you. I can imagine a mild one that could be, but an interesting possibility. Yep.
We thought that like you want to be the like least evil you could possibly be, but the problem is that exists on its own scale anyway. With like kindness as the virtue, and then lack of
Yeah.
evil is probably, I don't know, like it's
Maybe.
hard to find one that isn't. On
Well,
the-
good. I mean, the fact that it's hard, I mean, I guess speaks to it. I'm 90% sure one exception Aristotle talks about is knowledge. I believe there's others, but the fact that it was hard to think of an exception is a good sign, I guess. I saw a hesitant hand over here. Yeah.
I was thinking, if you're talking about virtues in a more general sense, can you just like list off traits like intelligence or like physical attributes or health? Or, like, if those are part of what we're talking about virtue.
Good, yeah, so intelligence, health, maybe could also be examples, right? So, because virtue is defined very broadly, so traits like that, presumably more is better. Yeah, those would also be possible exceptions. Good, okay. Okay, so next discussion question. This one I think should be easy. This one you'll probably think of too many and have to narrow it down, unlike this one. And the ancient Greeks did debate this, and they came up with a list of their own. But for you all, what are maybe the 3 or 4 most important virtues? And one way to operationalize that, if you could only ensure that your child had 3 to 4 virtues, which would you choose? Okay, going quiet again. It'd be funny if any group got the same. So as I say, in the Greco-Roman tradition, there was a commonly agreed upon list of 4. It'd be funny if anyone got the same one, but what are some lists or maybe a favorite from different groups? Yeah.
We did kindness, honesty, motivation, and critical thinking, which is that
Good.
was.
Yeah, a solid list. Any that groups want to add that are not on that list?
We said discipline.
Yep, okay, discipline, yep. That one's similar to one of the 4. Yeah.
We said resilience.
Resilience, yeah, so this is going to be important in one of the readings we're going to do. One reading argues that's essentially the personality trait that explains most of the variance in the Big 5, so we'll be talking about that. Okay, so in the Greco-Roman tradition, the virtues that they thought were most important were, and some of these are kind of old-fashioned terms. Okay. It's dead. Prudence. Here, I'll get the order right. Justice. Fortitude. And temperance. So prudence here meaning something like practical wisdom. Justice meaning treating people fairly. Fortitude meaning something like courage, so or perhaps similar to resilient. And temperance meaning self-control. The ability to not be overindulgent. You don't need to know this list for the test. You may have so in the Catholic tradition, they stole these 4 and then took 3 from the New Testament, faith, hope, and love. These are the 7 main virtues according to medieval philosophers. So you're all just getting used to coming back to class. Little fun clip. How many of you have seen Gladiator? Really? Okay, maybe I'm just old. Well, it's a great movie. So there's a great scene where the son of the emperor is a real person, Marcus Aurelius, who was a philosopher who wrote a lot about virtue. And Marcus Aurelius is saying to his son, "You will not be emperor." And then the son complains that his dad doesn't have the same idea of what virtue is as he does. And he talks about these 4. Kind of a fun clip. We'll watch that. Great villain origin story. I think they're making another one. Can anyone confirm? They are. Yeah, I think I vaguely remember. Okay. A few more. Well, I actually had to. I'm just remembering as I watched it. I had to do that once. I was an acting kid in high school, and we had to do monologues from movies. I chose that one. It was a lot of fun to do.
Do it.
No. That's okay.
Maybe on the last day.
Maybe.
I will
Okay.
remember.
Okay. So some other things that relate to this. For Aristotle, and Hank briefly mentioned this, an important idea that relates to virtue is telos, or purpose. So before the scientific revolution, the world was conceived of as having purpose. So why do things fall down? In the modern world, we describe why in terms of laws of nature, in terms of unbreakable patterns that can be described with equations. But Aristotle said it's because it's falling to its natural place. Right? The world is infused with purpose or teleology. And this applies to living things too. Living things have purposes built into them. And part of what it means to be virtuous is to live in accordance with one's telos or purpose. So, to take a non-living example, we wouldn't say that a knife is virtuous, but if we were to use that language, Aristotle would say a virtuous knife is one that cuts well. It functions in accordance with its purpose. Given that humans are rational and social beings, being virtuous means living in accordance with those purposes. So, using one's reason, having friendships, things like that are part of what it means to be a virtuous person. So someone mentioned resilience. One thing that the book mentions in passing is that Aristotle thought that the virtues were unified, that they sort of go together. And one interesting line of research that you could see as being consistent with this is models that try to extract one factor that explains variation in all of the other personality factors. We'll come back to that paper actually later in this chapter. I'm just flagging it because the book mentions it at this point. One consequence of the way that many of the ancient Greeks viewed virtue is that it's not possible to be a knowledgeable evil person. They thought that vice or evil is always ultimately the result of ignorance. There's something you're missing. There's something you don't know. I see one or two of you squirming. I squirm too. I think that's preposterous, but for whatever it's worth, people in this tradition generally say that ignorance is the cause of evil. Yes?
Is that like realism about knowledge or about philosophy?
That's a good question. So, yes, I do think you have to be some kind of realist, because virtue is something you can know about. And also you have to deny something like the Humean picture of motivation, where they think that just knowing something is enough to make you, want to do the right thing. So, yeah, you probably have to be a moral realist and a non-Humean about motivation. And since I am neither of those things, I find this pretty hard to be a pretty hard pill to swallow, but that is a consequence of what many of the ancient Greeks said. So this is an empirical psychology course. So what does psychology have to say about this? And here we get to the section on situationism. So there are a number of empirical studies in psychology finding that, at least in some cases, the situation exerts a greater influence on behavior than individual traits. Right? A virtue is kind of similar to, the term virtue is similar to the term trait in personality psychology. It just includes moral value, right? A virtue is a good trait, right? Where a trait is a kind of stable pattern in thinking, feeling, and behaving, right? So think of the big five, right? Classic trait theory. Each of the big five is supposed to pick out a pattern in how someone thinks, feels, and behaves. And then a virtue is just a good kind of trait. And one reason why it might be the case that many people, especially in the Western tradition, think that traits are more important is what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. Do any of you remember what this is from Intro Psych, the fundamental attribution error? Yep.
So it's when you, remember correctly, it's when you attribute something to someone's character.
Well,
like
that's it. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't need to add anything else. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So it's a tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their traits. So you can make situational attributions or personal ones, and this is a tendency to, when it's other people's behavior, explain it in terms of who they are. For ourselves, we have kind of a double standard. We explain our successes in terms of our traits and our failures in terms of the situation. And it was called the fundamental attribution error because there was so much evidence for it. It was conceptualized as kind of a core feature of human nature. But then there were attempts at cross-cultural replication, and it turns out that this bias either doesn't exist in non-individualistic cultures, or at least is greatly reduced. But this may explain why there's a tendency, at least in some traditions, to overemphasize the role of individual traits. So what are the studies that find that the situation is a powerful role? Well, I have some videos here, but I'm sure you've all seen these before. Like the Milgram study, where, if you're in a situation where someone's telling you to do something, most people go along with it, even if it's something really bad. And crucially, in that study, they measured various personal characteristics and found they predicted little to none of the variation in behavior. So like gender, education, religiosity, didn't matter. The variable that explained the big chunk of the variance is, was there an authority figure present or not? And then our first reading outside of the textbook, really clever little study that brings us out very nicely, how big of an effect the situation can have. They took a group of students studying to be Christian ministers. This is in a seminary. And they randomly assigned people to two conditions. One in which they were told to go to another room and deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan. Can anyone tell me what's the Good Samaritan story? Very famous. Yeah.
Basically, this guy gets mugged on his way back to town, and then, you know, like a priest and a couple of different guys that you would typically deem virtuous just sort of walk by him. But then this Samaritan, he stops and helps this guy and clothes him and
Yeah, exactly.
nurses
So
him
like,
back to life.
yeah, exactly. So the people you would think would help walk by and do nothing, and then a Samaritan who's kind of an ethnic rival of the people to whom this parable was addressed, he's the one who winds up helping the man who was mugged. So it is, at the end of the day, a story about helping, right? Not being the one to walk by and do nothing, but being the one to help. And then in the other condition, they have to give a talk just on like job opportunities or something morally neutral. So that's one condition, or one independent variable of two conditions. They manipulated another independent variable, so it's a 2x3 design. So one is one independent variable is Good Samaritan versus jobs. Another independent variable was how much time they were told they had to get to the place they had to give the talk. They were either told you'll be there early. If you leave now, they were another condition they're told you're going to be barely on time if you leave now, and then the other group is told you are already late. On the way over to the talk, there was set up someone writhing in pain, looking like they needed help, and they looked at how many people helped the person in distress. And I'm going to get the numbers up. So the effect of message was not statistically significant. Now that's often presented as kind of the punchline of the study. I suspect it was due to low power. So the effect size was 53% helped in the Good Samaritan condition and 29 in the other one. But this did not reach statistical significance. Whereas the effect of whether or not they were told they had time left over had an effect that did reach statistical significance. And the effect was as follows. In the early group, 63% offered help. In the in the barely on time, 45%, and in the already late, 10%. So very big effect of the situation, and moderate effect size for what sermon they had in their head, but didn't quite reach statistical significance. Additionally, the study also measured various religious traits. So they measured doctrinal orthodoxy, so how orthodox to standard Christian beliefs were their doctrines that they endorsed, and variables we've seen before, extrinsic religiosity and intrinsic religiosity. And these also did not statistically significant predict who would help and who would not. So this is an example of a study that found a big effect of the situation and not much for other things. So pretty dramatic finding. Any questions about the basic setup of the 2x3 design? Yeah.
Now, who studied this?
John Darley, and the other one's Daniel Batson, actually a guy we saw earlier. He's the empathy altruism guy. As I say, I suspect that the lack of an effect between Good Samaritan and the jobs condition is probably due to small sample size, because there's still a moderate effect size there, but given the sample size they had, it didn't reach significance. So what does this have to do with virtue ethics? Well, virtue ethics says that the way to be a good person is to cultivate the right kinds of character traits. But if it turns out that those character traits really don't make that much of a difference to our behavior in the real world, then that counts against this being a useful ethical theory. Now, some people in this same tradition, the kind of situationist tradition, say that what we should think of traits as being is if-then behavior contingencies. So traits are not, extroversion, it's rarely the case that even someone who says I'm high in extroversion is outgoing and confident all of the time. So what is sort of in our traits or in our personality is if I am in situation X, I will do Y. If I'm in situation B, I'll do A, or what have you. And one thing that Aristotelians have said to kind of push back against this criticism is that that's all Aristotle was ever really saying. And even in some of my comments and in some of the comments you saw from Hank Green, Aristotle clearly says that it's not the case that someone with virtue X will behave in that way in every situation. Part of what it is to be a virtuous person is to calibrate your behavior in response to different types of situations. Additionally, some of these studies do find that the effect of the situation is bigger than the effect of traits, but this is psychology, there's always going to be conflicting studies. If you break it down and do meta-analyses and look at effect sizes, so effect size is different from statistical significance or p-value, it's how big is the effect. So basically the bigger the effect, the smaller sample size you need for it to be statistically significant. So there is a connection between them, but strictly speaking, they're different. One common measure of effect size is Cohen's d. I don't think it's in the key term, so if it's not, don't worry about it. But just to give you an intuitive sense of what's going on here, Cohen's d is how many standard deviations apart are the two distributions. So let's say you have an antidepressant or something. You have the happiness ratings of the placebo group and the happiness ratings of the antidepressant group. So this is the gap between the two means. How many standard deviations is this? Right? So obviously the more the better. So in psychology, we're lucky if we ever get one. One would be like a whole standard deviation gap between the two distributions. So as I said, there's different measures of effect size. Generally speaking, 0.2 to 0.3, depending on maybe which type of effect size measure you use. But for both the situation and personality variables, that's usually where they fall. You'll find some studies where the situation has a big effect, like the Good Samaritan study, but in fact, when you take a sober look at the overall literature, that's generally what you find. So not quite as dramatic as some of the early situationist critics of virtue ethics said. Okay, and I already made the point that one way in which Aristotelians have responded is to say that Aristotle never meant that virtues mean you'll always behave in the same way if you have a certain trait. Part of it means calibrating your behavior to the situation. A term that relates to that response is it's accusing the situationist critics of Aristotle as engaging in the straw man fallacy. Does anyone know what the straw man fallacy is? Yep.
So it's when you say that this is what they're arguing, then you, when that's not what they're actually arguing. So saying, oh, they're saying this, therefore they're wrong. They're like, I never said that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's setting up a straw man, right? It's something that's easy to beat up. So, well, hey man, you're just saying that we should eat babies, and then the guy's like, well, I didn't say that. You know, that would be a silly case. But so what the Aristotelians are saying is the critics are beating up on a straw man, not Aristotle's actual position. Okay. Any questions? This is a pretty natural place to stop. Okay. See you all on Wednesday.